Okay, the final item of business this evening is our members' business debate on motion 11225 in the name of Keith Brown on fighting with pride and advocacy for LGBT+ veterans. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons and call on Keith Brown to open the debate. Around 7 minutes. Mr Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Earlier this year, I attended an event at the University of Stirling, which is in my constituency, and it was the official launch of Fighting with Pride in Scotland. Fighting with Pride is a veterans charity which works closely with veterans organisations across Scotland and the rest of the UK to improve the support available to LGBT+ armed forces veterans. And I'm very grateful to all those members that signed the motion to enable this to be debated today, and also would like to welcome those in the gallery from Fighting with Pride. In my constituency, Fighting with Pride has worked with veterans organisations like the Wee County Veterans and LGBT organisations like the Forth Valley Lavender Rooms, as well as supporting LGBT+ education in schools in my constituency, such as Dollar Academy. Fighting with Pride also works symbiotically with national veterans groups like Legion Scotland and Poppy Scotland to better support LGBT+ veterans across the country. Presiding Officer, Fighting with Pride's mission statement is to improve the support available for LGBT+ veterans, and one of the most critical aspects of doing this is by campaigning to right the wrongs perpetrated on LGBT+ armed forces members during the so-called gay ban, the ban on LGBT+ service members in the UK Armed Forces, which only ended in the year 2000, just 23 years ago. And it's my view that the so-called gay ban and the way in which it was implemented put LGBT+ members of the armed forces into a discriminatory situation in our society, notwithstanding the difficult social and legal situation faced by all LGBT+ people at that time. Because while homosexuality, in the terms of the time, was decriminalised for civilians in 1967 in England, and shamefully not until 1980 in Scotland, the ban on LGBT+ people being members of the armed forces remained in place until 2000. And that meant that those LGBT+ members of the armed forces, and they alone, were prevented by statute from loving those that they chose to love or living a life that was true to themselves. And it's for this exact reason that Fighting with Pride was set up in 2019. Indeed, a number of Fighting with Pride's members and supporters, as I mentioned, are in the gallery today, including the Operations Manager for Scotland and Northern Ireland, Dougie Morgan, a resident of my constituency. And I've met Dougie a few times, and he's described to me, not least in that first meeting which I mentioned in Stirling University, in his own words, how he had felt very different from a young age, although he did not at that time recognise that as being gay, and while he did privately know of his sexuality when he joined the Armed Forces in 1979, he had no concept of there being such a thing as a gay ban in place. However, and again in his own words, Dougie quickly came to realise that treatment that LGBT+ people could come to expect in the Armed Forces during that time, homophobic bullying, jokes, mistreatment, and in the most extreme cases, violent physical abuse or unfair detention or predatory sexual behaviour, not necessarily as a direct result of the ban itself, but as a result of the culture that was aided and abetted by the ban's presence. And after almost all of these instances, when someone was outed as being LGBT+, their time in the armed forces was ended almost always with immediate dismissal from the service. A sudden end to those people's chosen career simply because of who they were attracted to, who they loved, or how they identified themselves. And because of this experience, after leaving the forces, Dougie, in his own words, lived his life as someone else, masking his sexuality and pursuing a life which he felt would be socially acceptable in a way which being gay at that time simply was not. And during this period of his life, and because of what he had witnessed during his time in the forces, Dougie lived with complicated psychological issues, compounded by a challenging relationship with alcohol, a story which I understand from my discussion with Fighting with Pride is unfortunately far from unique. After being forcibly outed in 2009, Dougie met his own husband, both of whom were subject to a significant homophobic attack in 2016, the same year that they were married. And I mention this firstly because Dougie's story shows how far we have come in terms of LGBT+ rights and acceptance in a comparatively short time, but also how far we still have to go. It was in the aftermath of that attack that Dougie felt it was necessary to do something to ensure that others would not be forced to hide their sexuality and live a parallel life, which was not true to who they truly were, whilst also supporting LGBT+ veterans specifically. And from that point onwards, Dougie began to share his experience in schools and other groups, which eventually led to his involvement with Fighting with Pride, which was founded, as I've said, in 2019. But Dougie's story is just one of thousands of LGBT+ veterans across Scotland and the UK who've been affected by the gay ban. And I'm grateful for Dougie telling me about his story and allowing me to use it in this speech today to illustrate just one example of the adversity faced by LGBT+ veterans who served in the armed forces prior to the year 2000. In July of this year, the UK Government published the LGBT Veterans Independent Review, which, as the name suggests, was an independent review into the service and experience of LGBT veterans who served in the armed forces prior to 2000. The report is a comprehensive and detailed one, and I, for one, welcome it. In fact, I helped to contribute towards it. And in my view, the most pertinent part of the report is the Veteran Stories section, which ranges from page 51 to page 142. And that section gives a vast number of testimonies to the lived experience of LGBT+ veterans serving during the ban, outlining a picture of homophobic attitudes and jokes exacerbated and enabled by the ban, betrayal and disownment by friends and family due to being forcibly outed or dismissed from the service, PTSD caused by the homophobic and transphobic emotional and violent physical abuse while in the service, lifelong shame and guilt for being forcibly removed from a job that they loved simply because of their sexuality, and careers, families and livelihoods destroyed, all for no good reason. I would also say that my experience, and I know a number of members in the Chamber interact with a number of elements of what you might call the defence and veterans establishment, and to my mind, there are still substantial remnants of these attitudes present in these organisations. This is a case that's not yet been won. I won't want to name any of the charities, defence organisations, MOD or so on, but we have got further to do to change those attitudes. And I'd like to see across the board a much more proactive approach from those organisations. I would also absolutely recommend that everyone in the Chamber and everyone listening to the speech today takes the time to read the pages of the report that I mentioned. While they are useful for informing debates like this, they're only as good as the action they produce, though. And the report is helpful in that regard, as it outlines a number of recommendations and suggestions for the devolved governments and the UK Government to take to better support LGBT+ veterans. For my part, I have sought to bring awareness and action to the support we give to such veterans, and by bringing this members to debate to the Scottish Parliament, I note also the suggestions and the recommendations made in the report for the Scottish Government. I will work as an MSP in pursuit of those suggestions and would encourage others to do the same. And as for the UK Government's response to this, warm words have been forthcoming and an official apology issued, which is absolutely right and long overdue. However, one of the most significant long-term impacts of the so-called gay ban for those veterans, and other individuals and their friends and family, but also in institutions of government who are ultimately responsible for this ban, is the harm that it's caused. And it's for that reason the UK Government has a particular obligation towards LGBT+ veterans. And I was dismayed to read on Monday a BBC report which showed that the UK Government dropped a debate on the LGBT Veterans Independent Review in the UK Parliament, which had previously been promised by the UK Defence Secretary not long after the publication of the report. Now, I understand that that in itself has now been overturned, and there will be a debate in the House of Commons in the new year, which I think is very much welcome. Given the special obligation of the UK Government on this issue, I'd echo the words of Fighting with Pride's open letter to the UK Prime Minister, also published on Monday, which urges the UK Government to allow this debate to be held, and perhaps most importantly in the debate calls, as the motion that's up for the debate also does, for the UK Government to scrap the proposed £50 million cap on the fund for distribution for LGBT veterans affected by the gay ban. The obvious issue with the cap on that amount of compensation will be the amount of compensation available within that cap to individual veterans affected by the gay ban. That will inevitably decrease the amount to individual veterans the more veterans apply to the fund. It just stands to reason in terms of the maths. And it's fairly clear that that will not be sufficient to properly compensate individual veterans. So, Presiding Officer, to sum up, it's my view that the so-called gay ban is a shameful part of both Scotland and the UK's military history, and the way that those who were prepared to serve their country with loyalty and distinction were not met with that same loyalty in return. And that's something which cannot be justified, and which both Scotland and the UK must atone for, and I'd urge the UK Government to do so. And as a Parliament, we must stand united behind our LGBT+ veterans and call on the UK Government to do the same. Support Fighting with Pride and the immense work that they do to support LGBT+ veterans. And crucially, implement the recommendations of the report. And lastly, and most importantly, scrap the cap. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Brown. We now move